This is a significant moment, not just for Ukraine, but for the whole Western world. We've heard everyone from Sir Keir Starmer to the NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte marking the grim anniversary.
Well, you're absolutely right. It's day 1,000 of this conflict. That's 1,000 days of Russian aggression, 1,000 days of sacrifice by Ukraine. It's impacted the rest of the world, including the United Kingdom. I've been clear throughout those 1,000 days that we must give the Ukraine the support that is needed for as long as it's needed. That's something I've doubled down on here at G20 and in recent weeks. The simplest way to end this conflict is for Russia to stop the aggression.
And the missiles are game changer.
Well, I'm not going to comment.
It's been confirmed. It's been confirmed by Russia that they have landed in their territory.
Beth, you will understand. I'm not going to comment on operational details.
In principle, are the missiles a game changer? In principle.
The reason that I'm not going to comment is, I think, well understood, which is Putin is the winner if we do so, and it will undermine Ukraine, and I'm not prepared to do that.
Mark Rutte there, and before that, the PM speaking to Sky News' political
Today
editor,
we mark 1,000 days since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. 1,000 days. Tens of thousands of lives lost, millions of dreams destroyed. This war must end. Our support for Ukraine will not. We stand by you in your fight for freedom. We will continue to help ensure that Ukraine has what it needs to prevail and ultimately join the NATO alliance. There can be no peace in Europe without peace for Ukraine. So today and every day, we salute the brave Ukrainians who keep the flame of freedom burning bright. Their heroism and sacrifice are an inspiration to us all. Slava Ukraini.
Con Coughlin, our executive foreign and defence editor, is with us now. Welcome to the show, Con.
Pleasure.
You're a veteran correspondent and the author of several critically acclaimed books, including Saddam, The Secret Life, and his most recent book, Syrian Civil War, Assad, The Triumph of Tyranny. It's very good. I read it. You also write regularly for us on Russia and Ukraine. So let's wind the clock back 1,000 days. What did you think when it broke that Russia had invaded? Did you think Ukraine could last this long?
Well, I think I was very surprised at the time. I really didn't think that the Russians were going to do this because I couldn't see what was in it for them. And the international reaction that such an act would generate, I thought would persuade Putin to sort of wind down his forces. But he went in, and clearly it was a very serious attempt to capture Kyiv. That was the main objective, and the Russians had some very specialist forces, the Spetsnaz and paratroopers, all being parachuted into the outskirts of Kyiv. And the resistance from the Ukrainian people was truly amazing. And people forget that this conflict has been going on since 2014. And when the Russians first went into Ukraine and they captured Crimea, they met with very little resistance. And the big change between 2014 and 2022 was that the Ukrainian forces, with the help of us, the UK and the Americans, completely transformed their war-fighting capability. They had both the organizational discipline and the equipment, particularly anti-tank weapons, to give the Russians a very bloody nose. And really, the first year of the war, just as we know, we're now coming up to nearly 3 years of conflict. The first year of the war was really Ukraine's year. Having sort of dealt the Russians a body blow, they then regrouped, and by the end of the year, they were making quite dramatic gains, capturing Kherson in the south, Kharkiv in the north, and really pushing the advantage home. So much so, if you recall, that some very senior American generals were saying that the Ukrainians at this rate could retake Crimea. So that's where we were at the end of 2022. But the much vaunted Ukrainian offensive that was supposed to happen in the spring of 2023 never really materialized because the Russians this time had reorganized and got their act together and were a far more formidable force. And when the Ukrainians did advance, particularly in the south, they ran into these very well fortified Russian positions and were unable to take any significant ground. So by the end of 2023, we were in stalemate. And what we've seen this year in 2024, with the West still dithering about what kind of weapons it should give Ukraine and how they could use them, particularly This is particularly a problem with the Biden administration, which at every turn, when asked to upgrade the weapons to Ukraine, has hesitated. And the Russians have taken advantage of that equivocation. And until the sort of late summer, the Russians were on the offensive. Then we had this surprise initiative by the Ukrainians seizing Russian territory in Kursk region. This is quite dramatic, really, historically. This is the first time the Russians have lost territory to a foreign invading force since the Second World War. And this is a real ignominy for Vladimir Putin. But at the same time, the Russians have been pressurizing the depleted Ukrainian forces on the Eastern Front. And so you've got a rather dynamic situation. And fast forward to today, Biden's lost the election, Trump's coming in, and suddenly the Americans and their allies, including us, have suddenly decided, well, give the Ukrainians all the weapons they've been asking for throughout the course of 2024. And suddenly the Ukrainians have the initiative, and it begs the question: why has this happened, and what does Washington want to happen next?
Well, is it happening because an outgoing president is trying to escalate a conflict so that his successor inherits it and can't go to the peace table?
Well, I think that this is the $64,000 question, as they say in Washington. My own reading of this is that, as you will know, Biden met with Trump at the White House last week, ostensibly to discuss the transition. But the readouts of that meeting was that Ukraine was very much top of the agenda, and that Biden made the point to Trump, who, as most people know, spent the whole election campaign saying it was a waste of money supporting Ukraine, he wants a peace deal, etc. But Biden's message was, it's not in America's long-term interests for Russia to win this war. The fact that Trump has been quite silent since Biden gave the authorization for long-range attacks against Russian territory by the Ukrainians suggests to me that Trump's basically signed this off. And if there is to be a peace deal, there's a lot of speculation about this. If there is to be a peace deal, and Trump is negotiating the peace deal, he will want bragging rights. He will want to come out of that deal and say, look what I've got. And he can't go into the negotiating room if the Ukrainians are on the defensive and the Russians are reclaiming ground. So this could help Trump and a future negotiating process.
That's really interesting.
Con, let's listen to Donald Trump on the campaign trail, because as you say, he has made it clear, or has boasted maybe, that if he became president, which obviously he now will become on January the 20th, he would end the war in Ukraine. Let's just have a listen to exactly what it is he said.
Would you give Ukraine weapons and funding if you were elected?
I would sit down. Let me just put it a nicer way. If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
How would you settle that war in one day?
Because I'll meet with Putin, I'll meet with Zelensky. They both have weaknesses and they both have strengths. And within 24 hours, that war will be settled. It'll be over. It'll be absolutely over.
Do you want Ukraine to win this war?
I don't think in terms of winning and losing. I think in terms of getting it settled so we stop killing all these people.
Con, you've spoken about these new missiles that have been unleashed and are now being used, ATACMS and Storm Shadow. Can you just talk us through the significance of the use of those missiles and why you think Washington has taken so long to give the permissions?
Well, let me start with the latter part of your question. From the outset of this conflict, from February 2022, the fundamental policy of the Biden administration has been to avoid any escalation of the conflict. And in my view, the Biden administration has been far too susceptible to the threats Putin has made, particularly about his nuclear arsenal. He's been making these from day one, that if the West gets too involved, remember the Russian nuclear arsenal is bigger than anybody else's. And Biden's been risk-averse throughout this conflict. And whenever the Ukrainians have asked for more weapons, he's did them, whether it's F-16s, tanks. Fast forward to this year, and giving Ukraine the ability to strike targets on Russian soil has been a great necessity for the Ukrainians. The Russians regularly launch attacks on Ukraine from Russian soil, and under the laws of war, you are quite entitled to respond by attacking those sites. As I said, Biden's been very risk-averse and has denied the Ukrainians the ability to use long-range missiles, mainly US missiles, but also British Storm Shadows, to attack positions in Russia, which would really benefit Ukraine because that disrupts the Russian advance. You can hit their missile silos, you can hit their troop headquarters and all the rest of it, and really disrupt their operations and their offences. So the fact that the Biden administration, after he's lost the election, has now given this authorization, which also allows the UK missiles to be used because the Americans control all the satellites and intelligence gathering apparatus that feed into the directional targeting of these missiles. But by allowing this to happen, the Ukrainians can now basically hit the Russians where it hurts. And of course, Putin yet again has raised the spectre of nuclear war, as he's done on every other occasion where there's been an increase in Western military support. And in my view, this is just more bluster by the Russians because they find themselves in a hole. People have said the Ukrainians have been fighting this war with one hand behind their backs. Well, now they've got both their hands free, and they could really give the Russians a bloody nose in the coming weeks.
What will make some people nervous is that they're delivering this bloody nose with British-made weapons. Now, I'm not expecting to be quoted on this show, but I will quote Jeremy Corbyn, who said that Keir Starmer must come to Parliament and, quote, tell the British public if the use of these weapons means we are now at war with a nuclear power. Does he have a point? Does this put Britain in jeopardy?
Well, if Jeremy Corbyn was running the country, Putin would be in Kyiv now. So, I mean, his credibility is shot. I mean, it is an issue, but we are supplying the weapons to Ukraine. We have every right to do that.
Yeah.
The North Koreans are arming Russia. Iran is arming Russia. China's arming Russia. We're not picking a fight with them. We have every right, as do our allies, the US and Germany and others, to supply weapons to Ukraine. The important thing is it's Ukrainians firing them. If we had British troops, if we still had British troops, if we had British troops in Ukraine firing these weapons, then that is a major escalation and puts us in direct confrontation with Russia. But that's not happening, and so I fear that Putin's talking out of his proverbial, and as is Corbyn.
Let's bring in Francis Dearnley, who's currently in Ukraine, reporting with the Ukraine the Latest podcast team. Francis, thank you so much for joining us from Ukraine. Let's kick off with this idea of a possible peace deal. But before we get to that, I'd just like to hear about your week there. Obviously, travelling there in this momentous few days that we've been hearing about in the UK. What's it been like? What is the mood like on the ground?
Well, thanks, London. I mean, it's been a very interesting few days. One had expectations that given the, of course, historic decisions made in the past 48 hours, that we would see or would come to a city that was feeling very tense in the form of Kyiv. But actually, that was not the case. I was quite struck almost immediately by the degree to which people have been carrying on with everyday lives, but with one key difference, which is that when the air raid sirens went, they did go down to the shelters. If you can imagine being at war for almost 3 years, when an air raid siren goes off almost every day, you don't always go down to the shelter. But this week they have been, and for the simple reason that they were concerned, particularly yesterday, that they just didn't know what Russia was going to do in response to the use of storm shadows and, of course, the attackings by President Biden. So there is a expectation there will be some kind of response, and indeed we've seen, of course, the use of the intercontinental missiles today. But as somebody put it to me here in Ukraine earlier on, Russia only have a few dozen of them, and now they're two less. So they are not feeling overly anxious about the situation, which might surprise people given the huge statements that have been made by world leaders in the past 24 hours.
The conversation, Francis, has obviously changed dramatically with the election of the President-elect Donald Trump. Talk of a peace deal is now one of the leading narratives about early 2025 and the war. Is there any appetite that you can feel, being on the ground there in Ukraine, that there's going to have to be some form of peace? Will Ukraine ever be able to become a member of NATO? And will it have to cede territory to Vladimir Putin?
Well, this has been one of my priorities in being out here. And it's been very interesting because what I expected was you'd speak to politicians, particularly elected members of the parliament, and they would say to you, whether in public or in private, look, we feel that we must fight on, that this is the only way with the intelligence that we have and knowing Russia, that we have to continue fighting. And that would be the official public line, as it has been from President Zelensky. And then I expected that when you spoke to ordinary people, that they would say there's been enough bloodshed, enough suffering, we are ready for some kind of peace. What I found instead is the opposite. And I don't want to say that this is necessarily typical of all of Ukraine. I can only speak for those conversations I've had in the last few days. But in fact, it's been the politicians who have been more, I would say, sympathetic to the idea of opening negotiations now, to at least having conversations about what form peace might look like, whether that be NATO membership or otherwise, as part of the deal that is struck. And ordinary people say, well, actually, you can't trust Russia. There's no deal that would be on the table that many Ukrainians would be willing to accept. That's not to say that they have bloodlust, that they want to continue fighting. Far from it. You can see the sense of loss and hardship in everyone's face here. And they think there are a lot more reasons why they should continue at least making the case for fighting on and asking for the support from the West, rather than the tone of conversation that one has heard in Western capitals. So it's been quite striking. And to give one tangible example, I spoke to a lady in her 50s, early 60s yesterday, and she ended that interview by saying, we have to fight on. Quite striking.
It's interesting that you're picking up such a consensus on what 2025 should look like for Ukrainians. Let's hear a clip from your interview with Oleksandr Merechko. He's a Ukrainian MP and chair of the Committee on Foreign Policy and Interparliamentary Relations, who says that he thinks the very idea of negotiations is a non-starter.
I think that we have serious problem with the very idea of starting negotiations. First of all, if we're talking about negotiations, for example, about ceasefire, we need to have them from the position of strength. Second, there is a political aspect to that. I would compare the situation in Ukraine with 1940 and the UK. And there was a famous debate or discussion between Lord Halifax and Winston Churchill. Lord Halifax, after the failure at Dunkirk, he was insisting on starting negotiations with Hitler, and Churchill was against. And the reason for that was that Churchill understood that as soon as they start negotiations, it would be more difficult to boost morale and to continue a war. So there is political psychological aspect to this issue. But most importantly is that in order to have any kinds of negotiations, you should be sure about your counterpart, about the other side, that if you reach any kind of agreement, the other side will abide by it, will keep its word. But Putin has proven many times that he's not reliable. He's absolutely not trustworthy. He's not credible. And for this reason, the logical question arises. Why should we start negotiations with someone, with Putin, who will definitely not abide by the reached agreements? So it makes no sense to me.
And I should say, Kamal, that view there articulated by Alexander is more typical that ordinary people are expressing, and it's politicians who tend to have a different view.
You can hear the full interview with Alexander in yesterday's Ukraine, the latest episode, which we will link to in the show notes. One other thing we want to ask you, Francis, is that there's talk about some Ukrainian politicians gearing up for post-war elections. I know it's an issue you touched upon in another Ukraine the Latest episode this week. What we'd like to know is this crazy talk or is there something in it? And who on earth could ever take over from Zelensky, the war hero?
Well, I don't think there's any conversations yet about a serious prospect of an election anytime soon. When you speak to politicians here, you get the sense that they are aware that there are so many more steps to get to that point, whether it be involving the removal of martial law, which will take some time, and indeed an ending to the war that can mean that elections can take place because people would be safe to conduct them without fear of airstrikes, etc. But, and it's a big but, there are conversations about what that roadmap looks like. And you can sense, and quite often the conversations are off the record, but you can sense that they are taking private polling, that they are taking the pulse of the nation. And indeed, they are, I think, thinking about a post-Zelensky administration and what that might look like. I think there is an understanding here amongst some that President Zelensky is a wartime leader who has done an exceptional job, but perhaps when the time for peace comes, that there will be a requirement for somebody else, and they're looking at who those candidates might be. And those names will be familiar to anybody who has been following the war for as long as we have. So names like Zaluzhny, who was the former commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian armed forces. He's now ambassador to Ukraine in London. He's now the Ukrainian ambassador to London and is based in London, away, one might say, from the political arena deliberately because of his popularity, essentially a political exile in that sense. There's other names like General Bodanov, head of the intelligence, like General Bodanov, who's head of the military intelligence here. So they are already taking soundings on those things, but I think that they are all aware that it's still a long, long way away.
Francis, that's really surprising to me that they wouldn't just be thinking of Zelensky being a peacetime leader as well as a wartime leader, because I would have assumed he was so hugely popular and respected, especially within the country and on the global stage. Why wouldn't Zelensky be? Why might Zelensky leave his post in the post-war era?
Well, I think there's two things going on. One is, of course, that people, when they're thinking of the future, they're thinking about which political leader might be the one who can serve them best. And of course, we all know the famous example of Churchill elected out of office in 1945. People were grateful for Churchill's efforts, but they still booted him out because they wanted to have a government come in who they thought would serve them better. But I think also we tend to overestimate the popularity of President Zelensky in Ukraine. There is, of course, a deep admiration for him and a respect for the work that he has done in keeping the nation together. But people have different approaches to what needs to happen next, whether they be opposed to the idea of negotiations, whether they be in favor of negotiations. People have been critical about the messaging from President Zelensky for some time. He has not really changed position for several years now, and some people get frustrated from that, from both sides of the spectrum, whether they be more hawkish or more in favor of peace. Also, of course, there has been a long period of time now where there has not been a sizable victory for Ukraine in the military sense. It's been incremental, slow defeats, one could argue, particularly in the east. Yes, there was the Kursk incursion into Russia, but that too is slowing down, and there has not been something that Ukrainians can point at and say, this was a victory that Zelensky achieved. And when you're 3 years into a war as devastating as this one, that does begin to erode trust, as it would in any political leader. And I think President Zelensky is of an exceptional caliber, but he's not immune to democratic politics. No one is.
Francis, we were speaking to your colleague, Dom Nichols, who I know is at least going to be with you or already with you for Ukraine the Latest in Ukraine. And we asked him on the podcast a couple of days ago. He made a very similar point to you about Winston Churchill and Clement Attlee here in the UK at the end of the Second World War. Having been now in Ukraine for a few days, you've obviously made it clear to us that in Ukraine they think the battle should continue. I just wondered, Francis, what you think will happen, given that Donald Trump has now, or the allies of Donald Trump, J.D. Vance in particular, have made it clear he will be suing for peace of some description. Now that you've had your journey to Ukraine, you're continuing your journey to Ukraine, what do you think is actually going to happen over the next 3 to 6 months?
Well, it's very, very difficult. And I think that anybody who has a clear answer to that is simply being misleading. I think the most likely outcome at the moment is that we wait and see what Trump's real attitude is. There's great uncertainty here as to whether, with the appointments that he's made, he is more sympathetic to putting Ukraine in a stronger military position and thereby using that as the springboard for discussions, or whether he wants out as soon as possible, more of a kind of Afghanistan-style withdrawal that we saw in President Biden's time. So until we have an answer to that question, and I don't think we do yet, it's very, very difficult to make predictions. But one thing I would say is that anybody who believes there is a tangible path to negotiations needs to answer certain fundamental questions. One of them is, how do you even bring the two sides to the table when Russia has said clearly that the price of even having the conversation start is an admission by Ukraine that it cedes vast amounts more territory in the east than Russia currently controls. There is no political appetite for that here in Ukraine. So that is already one step. The next step is about security guarantees and what those might look like. There is clearly no consistent approach that the West has put forward onto the table that will mean that Ukrainians can say with confidence that if there is a conversation about peace, that they will feel secure and that there isn't going to be a war that's going to start in another year, 2 years, 10 years' time. There's no political appetite for ceding more territory. There also needs to be conversations, serious conversations about what security guarantees would look like. That will take months. So I think anybody who thinks, and I think this is quite a common belief in the West at the moment, that we could see a situation where Trump comes in January, and by the end of February, talks are taking place, and maybe we've got peace by April. It is not, I think, the most likely scenario by any stretch of the imagination. I think it's going to take months and months and months to get to the stage where there can even be agreements, hypothetical agreements, about what the parameters of the talks are. And I don't see peace being something that is achievable in a short time frame.
Thanks so much, Francis, for joining us from Ukraine on the Daily Tea podcast. Obviously, keep yourselves safe. The team should stay safe. We'll let you crack on with your reporting.
Thank you very much.
Still with us is our executive foreign and defence editor, Con Coughlin. Con, Zelensky himself has said that Donald Trump's victory means the war will end sooner than expected. Here he is speaking to a Ukrainian radio station.
Політикою цієї команди, яка зараз очолить Білий дім, війна закінчиться швидше. А з нашого боку ми повинні зробити все, щоб у наступному році ця війна закінчилась дипломатичними шляхами.
Con, what do you make of all this? Does Trump have any chance of striking a peace deal? And if he does, what's the best case scenario for Ukraine?
Well, I think Trump certainly thinks that he can strike a peace deal. I think the fact that he's been a bit more reticent since he won the election suggests that he's now having a serious rethink about how he needs to approach this. I mean, the one thing we know about Trump is if he does a deal, he wants to come out of it looking good. And if he goes into a negotiation process that ends up capitulating to Russia and Putin running around saying he's won the war, that's not going to make Trump feel very happy. So how does he get to a position where he can get a deal, which he clearly wants to do next year? And I think even Zelensky is indicating that next year is the year for negotiation. He wants to be able to go into that negotiating room with something behind him. So the first thing he can beat the Russians with is the fact that at the moment the Ukrainians are holding Russian territory in Kursk. That's an important bargaining chip for Putin. As I said earlier, losing this territory for the first time since the Second World War is a national humiliation that needs to be addressed. That could give him something, but he also needs to make sure that the Ukrainians are holding their positions in the east and not losing any more territory. Hence the landmines are going there to stop the Russians breaking through. I mean, I think one of the reasons there's been in this recent upsurge in Western support is I think some people are saying there's a very serious possibility the Russians could break through the Ukrainian lines before Biden leaves office, which would be absolutely humiliating for Biden. So all these things are in play, but at the back of his mind, Trump will be thinking, if I'm going into these talks and I want to get a good deal out of them, I need something to bargain with. So that's why giving the Ukrainians these missiles, a lot of other support, letting them have a go at the Russians before Biden leaves office, this could play to Trump's strengths, and so that there is a deal that is not too humiliating for the Ukrainian people.
If Russia do retain some Ukrainian territory, Dom Nichols, one of the co-presenters of Ukraine the Latest, he said Russia will be back because ultimately Russia wants Ukraine to be back as part of Russia. So whatever happens during the Trump presidency over the next 4 years, it is only a staging post as far as Putin and Russia are concerned in their ultimate goal, which is to retake, as they would see it, Ukraine.
Well, I think Dom makes a very good point. And I think the reason it's so important for the West to maintain its support for Ukraine is to basically send a message to Moscow that military aggression of this nature, whether it's in Ukraine or anywhere else, is not to be tolerated. The problem we've had is going back to Georgia in 2008, when Putin's engaged in military aggression, we haven't done very much about it. Well, we are now. And if we don't want a direct confrontation between NATO and Russia in the years to come, then we need to make sure that the way the Ukraine conflict ends does not end in a way where the Russians can claim some kind of credit. I mean, I think the really problematic area is going to be Crimea, because even some Ukrainians are now saying, well, regaining Crimea would be very difficult. But the Ukrainians have done a lot of damage to the Russian Black Sea fleet in Crimea. So that these are all factors that will go into the mix. But Dom's right. If we don't get any deal right with Russia now, then the Russians will be back for more.
Do you imagine that Ukraine should still be allowed to start the process of joining NATO as part of this deal?
Well, I think. I mean, when I've been travelling in Ukraine in the past, I mean, I covered the initial revolution in 2004, and one of the big problems then, and it continues to this day, is corruption in Ukraine. And a lot of people in Brussels, in NATO, feel that until Ukraine puts its house in order, membership of these kind of institutions is some way off. So we've got a long way to go. But, the fact that the Ukrainians are now flying F-16s, the fact that they've now got Challenger tanks, other Western tanks, Abrams and all the rest of it, the Ukrainians are sort of de facto being brought into the NATO alliance. So there is going to be some closer alliance between NATO and Ukraine. It might stop short of full membership, but that is the direction of travel. And if the Ukrainian people want it, there's not much Putin can do about it.
Con, you've touched on North Korea, who have troops supporting Russia. You've touched on Iran supporting Russia. We haven't yet spoken in detail about China. Obviously, China backs North Korea. What is their role here? Trump, again, has made it very clear he's going to be hyper-aggressive economically with China. You've also got the issue of Taiwan, and Trump saying that China will be stopped from invading that country. In terms of its role here in Ukraine, Russia, President Xi, how should we be considering what next steps might be for him?
Well, he'll be watching this very, very carefully. I mean, I think President Xi, first of all, will be rather taken aback at the size of Trump's victory in the elections, because I think he would far prefer to deal with Kamala Harris in the years to come. But the sort of Sino-Russian relationship is a complex one. Russia is very much the junior partner in this relationship. the Chinese joke that they see Russia as a gas station. And because of the sanctions we've imposed against Russia, the Chinese have got some very favourable deals in terms of energy supply. So, but also the Chinese see this whole conflict as testing the resilience of the NATO alliance. I think a lot of people in Moscow and Beijing thought that the West would not have the resolve to stand up to Russia and support Ukraine. Here we are, nearly 3 years into the conflict, and that Western support is still there. In fact, it's been strengthened, as we discussed today. And the Chinese will be watching this very closely. I would also say the Chinese have made it very clear to Putin that any use of nuclear weapons by the Russians is completely unacceptable. So, I mean, at the same time, the Chinese have given the Russian military the technology to improve their drones, which is why the Russians have been doing so well with their drones on the battlefield. So the Chinese are playing their own games. But will they want to be on a losing side? They won't want to be seen to be on a losing side. And certainly in terms of their ambitions towards Taiwan, they will be waiting to see how this plays out before they do anything in their own neck of the woods.
Con Coughlin, thank you so much for all your expertise in this area.
Pleasure.
Of course, thank you to Francis Dearnley in Ukraine and the whole team that are there. Do listen to Ukraine the Latest podcast, which has huge amounts of in-depth coverage on this issue. Thank you, Tim, for joining me on this special edition on Ukraine and the continuing war with Russia, one of the biggest global issues for the whole of 2025. We'll be back on Monday, 5 o'clock.